Over 200 Palestinians have been killed by Israeli airstrikes in the Gaza Strip in just the last 24 hours. That takes the death toll in the Palestinian enclave to more than 10,500 people. The worst fighting in decades followed a surprise attack launched by the Palestinian armed group Hamas in Israel on the 7th of October. Human Rights Watch is now calling for attacks on ambulances to be investigated as possible war crimes. For more on this, let's speak to the group's senior Israel-Palestine researcher, Omar Shakir. Omar, very good evening to you. Good to have your time. So, what do you believe has gone on with these attacks on the ambulances in the Gaza Strip? Because there was at least one incident where the IDF, the Israeli military, claimed that, in fact, they struck the vehicle just outside a hospital because Hamas operatives were using it to get around.
We've seen a shocking and horrifying range of attacks on health facilities and hospitals in the Gaza Strip. Hospitals in Gaza are not only treating the thousands, in some cases tens of thousands injured in Israel's relentless bombardment, but they have also become home to the tens of thousands displaced people in Gaza. The World Health Organization reports on scores of strikes on hospitals, and they have noted that those strikes have killed hundreds of people, including more than a dozen health workers on the job. Hospitals, medical facilities, ambulances must always be protected. International humanitarian law is clear that hospitals have special protections under the law. It's not enough just to claim that they were a military target, that a party was using them for military operations. You must show a higher threshold that they were being used to commit acts against the enemy that caused harm to the enemy, and the Israeli government has simply failed to do so. Human Rights Watch reviewed the evidence of a strike on an ambulance near a Shifa hospital. The videos showed a woman in a stretcher in the ambulance, and children, women, people around the ambulance killed or injured in the strike. No evidence that Israel's claims had verifications, and this should be investigated as a potential war crime.
Where does one even begin to investigate at this stage, Omar, considering that ultimately, at this point, investigators or organizations such as yourself, even international media, is not able to get into Gaza to look into what's going on, confirm or debunk what's being said?
That's an intentional strategy. I mean, the Israeli government has been blocking access for international human rights investigators, UN mechanisms, to Gaza and the occupied Palestinian territory for years. Human Rights Watch, our senior staff, has only been allowed in once since 2008. Journalists are not in to report, but at the same time, Human Rights Watch has worked in contexts around the globe, including places like Syria, where we haven't had access always to on-the-ground investigations, so we use other technology. Right now, we're using satellite imagery. We're using a team of experts to verify video footage from the scene. We are talking to witnesses, doctors on the ground. We're having our munitions and weapons experts review photographs that we verified. So these different means of investigations do take time, but they do allow us eventually to start making determinations, such as we did here about this being an apparent unlawful airstrike. And we've documented unlawful airstrikes and war crimes by Israeli authorities over the years. We've documented every round of hostilities between Palestinian armed groups and Israel, and we'll continue to do so, and we'll continue to push for perpetrators of serious crimes to be held to account.
So you say you've got satellite imagery, you've got video evidence which you say proves that this ambulance outside Al-Shifa hospital was in fact carrying a woman who was unwell, and that even the people around there who were killed in the strike or injured included children. But how does one then conduct a credible war crimes investigation without direct access? Would what you have seen be sufficient to draw or reach a legal conclusion as far as the war crimes aspect is concerned?
Look, the burden is on the warring party to produce the evidence. That's what the law says. It's not on, the investigators. And what the Israeli government has put forward, quite simply, would not justify striking an ambulance given the special protections they have. They merely claimed that, that they were fighters inside the ambulance. But international humanitarian law requires a more significant showing, which the Israeli government simply hasn't met. Our call is for this attack to be investigated as a war crime, and if it is indeed confirmed as a war crime, then those responsible for it, including at the highest levels of the Israeli government, should be be investigated and prosecuted for the commission of those crimes. We reached a conclusion based on the evidence available to us, including video footage, including interviews that we did on the scene, including looking at satellite imagery. It led us to this conclusion. But of course, it's up to a court of law to ensure that that's investigated, a conclusion is made, and perpetrators are held to account.
What are the chances, realistically, though, that anyone would be punished if indeed it wasn't Hamas using this ambulance, and as you say, it was civilians killed by Israel without legitimate reason to do so? Because, for example, just last year, there was the calls for an investigation into the killing of Al Jazeera journalist Shireen Abu Akleh, also by an Israeli sniper. Initially, there was a denial that that was who was responsible for killing her, and then ultimately the final explanation was that, well, she was killed by accident, and therefore no consequences were ever meted out to the person responsible or even the IDF.
Look, the problem of impunity for grave abuses isn't unique to Israel-Palestine. We see it across the Middle East. We see it across the world. That said, we currently do have a formal investigation at the International Criminal Court into serious crimes committed in or from Palestine. The prosecutor was recently at the Rafah border crossing between Gaza and Egypt, made clear comments that this investigation is a priority, that they are looking into the current events and other issues, and that they're do hope for there to be accountability beyond the International Criminal Court. We do have a commission of inquiry that was established after the last major round of hostilities that has a mandate to collect evidence and to help support the fight for accountability. The International Court of Justice currently was asked by the UN, and they'll be hearing on the prolonged consequences of Israel's occupation in February. States like South Africa have made submissions to that body. So there are now fora for these issues to be adjudicated. Not all of them are criminal ones, but they exist. And I think the challenge for the international community is to ensure support for those institutions and allow them to do their work, because what we're seeing on the ground is a test of the international community and international law, and the consequences of failing to meet that test will reverberate far beyond Israel-Palestine and will affect the credibility of these institutions.
The health ministry in Gaza repeatedly says that the thousands of people who've been killed, death toll now above 10,000, are civilians, majority of them women and children, is what they're saying. Well, Israel, even the Americans have tried, especially in the last week and a half, to say, in fact, those numbers aren't credible and that they may very well be much lower. And whenever there's a question about strikes on an area such as the entrance to Al-Shifa Hospital, the Jabalia refugee camp, the Israelis say, well, we strike these areas because there are Hamas people, operatives in the area, and that is why we're going after them. They're embedded in the communities. Is there anyone actually at this stage who can tell us who is and is not a member of Hamas, given how densely populated the areas are, how many people have had to flee into one part of an already heavily populated area to try and find safety?
And look, I mean, just because somebody is Hamas does not make them a legitimate target. International humanitarian law has clear standards. There are basic rules that you must distinguish between combatants and civilians, and that civilians must be protected. There must be feasible precautions taken to spare them from armed conflict. Strikes cannot be disproportionate. So the reality here is Israel is incessantly bombing the Gaza Strip. They're reducing entire blocks, large parts of neighborhoods to rubble. They have a long track record of disregard for Palestinian life, of indiscriminate attacks, of disproportionate attacks. The research Human Rights Watch and others are doing are ongoing. Israel continues to drop explosive weapons with wide area effects. I'm talking about aerial bombs and heavy artillery in refugee camps, on hospitals, on schools, on so many other facilities, which creates a foreseeable risk to civilians. The obligation, again, is on Israel when doing so to show that they're following the laws of international humanitarian law, and their track record is one for continuously disregarding them. So I think it's really critical that states, be very categorical in calling on Israel to refrain from indiscriminate, unlawful attacks and to really put pressure on them and condemn war crimes when they're carried out. Human Rights Watch has documented Israeli war crimes in these hostilities, and before they must end.
Omar Shakir from Human Rights Watch, thank you so much for your time.